Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Monster. Jeffrey Dahmer's name is synonymous with horror. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer murdered 17 men in crimes so gruesome they shocked the nation. His actions involved dismemberment, cannibalism, and necrophilia, revealing a mind consumed by darkness. To the outside world, Dahmer was a quiet, awkward man living an ordinary life. But behind closed doors, his Milwaukee apartment was a house of horrors. The beginnings of darkness. Born in 1960, Dahmer grew up in an unstable home. As a teenager, he became fascinated with death, often collecting animal bones and fantasizing about control and domination. These signs of deviance were ignored, and by the time he was 18, Dahmer had committed his first murder. He killed hitchhiker Stephen Hicks, lured to his home under the pretense of companionship, and dismembered the body, a pattern he would repeat for years. A methodical predator, Dahmer's victims were mostly young men of color whom he met at bars, bus stops, or on the streets of Milwaukee. His method was calculated. He lured victims with promises of money or drinks, drugged them, and strangled them. But it didn't end there. Dahmer mutilated the bodies, keeping trophies such as skulls and organs. In some cases, he even consumed parts of his victims, believing it made them a permanent part of him. His later crimes grew more twisted. Dahmer attempted to create zombies by drilling into his victims' skulls and injecting acid, a horrifying effort to render them submissive and incapable of leaving him. The apartment of horrors. Neighbors often complained about foul odors and strange noises coming from Dahmer's apartment. But he always had an explanation: spoiled meat or a broken freezer. In reality, his apartment was a macabre workshop. Police later found severed heads in the refrigerator, a barrel of acid for dissolving bodies, and Polaroid photos documenting his gruesome acts. A twisted mind. Dahmer admitted that his crimes were not driven by hatred but by loneliness and a compulsion for control. "I didn't kill because I hated them," he said. "I wanted them to stay with me." Psychologists diagnosed him with borderline personality disorder and psychotic tendencies. But he was ultimately deemed sane and fully aware of his actions. Capture and trial. Dahmer's spree ended in July 1991 when Tracy Edwards, a potential victim, escaped and alerted police. Inside Dahmer's apartment, officers discovered evidence of his murders, including body parts and tools of dismemberment. At his trial, Dahmer pled guilty to 15 murders. He expressed remorse, telling the court, "I knew I was sick or evil or both." He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, ensuring he would never leave prison. Death in prison. Dahmer's time in prison was brief. In November 1994, fellow inmate Christopher Scarver killed him during a work detail, bludgeoning him with a metal bar. Dahmer's violent death marked a fittingly grim end to his life of brutality. A lasting impact. Jeffrey Dahmer's story is one of horror and profound societal failure. His crimes revealed the dangers of unchecked warning signs and systemic neglect, including missed opportunities by police to intervene. His case remains a chilling reminder of how evil can lurk beneath the most unassuming surface. Even decades later, the scars left by Dahmer's crimes remain, a haunting legacy of one of America's most notorious serial killers. The Green River Killer. Gary Ridgway's Trail of Death. Gary Ridgway, infamously known as the Green River Killer, is one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Over a span of nearly 2 decades, Ridgway is believed to have murdered at least 49 women, though he later claimed the number could be closer to 80. His victims were primarily young women, often sex workers or vulnerable individuals he believed would not be missed. Operating in Washington state during the 1980s and 1990s, Ridgway blended into society as a quiet, unassuming man, a facade that allowed him to evade capture for years. A calculated predator, Ridgway's methods were both chilling and methodical. He targeted women he believed to be easy prey, often luring them into his truck with promises of money or rides. Once they were isolated, Ridgway would strangle them, frequently using his bare hands. This, he later explained, allowed him to avoid leaving evidence like rope or ligature marks. After killing his victims, he would dispose of their bodies in remote wooded areas or along the Green River, which inspired his nickname. Adding to the horror, Ridgway often revisited the sites where he dumped the bodies, sometimes engaging in necrophilia with the corpses. His twisted rationale for these actions stemmed from a desire to save money by avoiding the need to find new victims. Living a double life. What makes Ridgway's story particularly disturbing is how ordinary he seemed. A married man and a devout churchgoer, Ridgway worked as a truck painter for decades and maintained a stable job. His co-workers described him as quiet and unremarkable, a man who rarely drew attention to himself. At home, he was a seemingly normal husband who enjoyed gardening and working on his yard, a far cry from the predator stalking the streets of Seattle. Evading capture. Ridgway's killing spree began in 1982, but it took nearly 20 years to bring him to justice. Early on, police struggled to identify him due to the lack of physical evidence and the transient nature of his victims, many of whom were not reported missing immediately. Though Ridgway was questioned in the 1980s and even passed a polygraph test, he remained under the radar. Advances in DNA technology ultimately led to his arrest in 2001. Evidence collected from the bodies of several victims matched Ridgway's DNA, finally unmasking the quiet man as the Green River Killer. The confession. After his arrest, Ridgway cooperated with investigators to avoid the death penalty. He admitted to killing 49 women but suggested the number could be much higher. His confessions were chillingly detached. He described his murders as routine, almost mundane, and spoke with little emotion about the pain he caused. Ridgway claimed that his hatred for sex workers drove his actions. He believed their deaths would go unnoticed and even considered his killings as a form of cleaning up the streets. However, his motives were not entirely ideological. He also admitted to being motivated by a desire for control and sexual gratification. The trial and sentence. Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder in 2003, making him the most prolific convicted serial killer in U.S. history at the time. In exchange for his cooperation, he was spared the death penalty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the trial, families of the victims confronted Ridgway, many expressing their pain and anger. Yet, one moment stood out. A father of one of the victims forgave him, bringing Ridgway to tears, a rare emotional response from the otherwise stoic killer. A legacy of horror. The Green River Killer's crimes left a lasting impact on Washington state and beyond. His ability to lead a double life and elude capture for so long raised troubling questions about law enforcement's ability to track predators. His case also highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized communities, as many of his victims were young women on the fringes of society. Even now, questions linger about the true extent of Ridgway's crimes. While he is serving life in prison, his legacy as a calculating and prolific killer serves as a grim reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary of lives. Gary Ridgway may never see freedom again, but the scars he left on his victims' families and the community remain an enduring testament to the horrors of his actions.